There are participants from all over the world. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on investing in education and training in the era of COVID-19 and beyond. My name is Boran Shakroun. I'm the Director of the Division for Policy and Lifelong Learning Systems, and I will be moderating this webinar this afternoon. Please kindly note that this webinar is recorded for wider sharing. Today, we have English, on parle français, hablamos español, and we will have interpretation in the 3 languages. You may choose your preferred channel via the globe icon. Also, please share your question via the Q&A function. Also share any resources that you would like to share with the participants, with the speakers, and with the organizers. We'll have a dedicated session at the end of this webinar for the Q&A sessions. Dear colleagues, today's webinar is focusing on investment in education with the perspective on how best we can put resources for education and protect education in the context of the COVID-19 response, but also in the recovery phase. It is indeed a continuation of the discussion we started during the extraordinary session of the Global Education Meeting 2020, convened in October, where the international community adopted the 2020 Global Education Meeting Declaration in the presence of head of states and government, ministers and officials, and international development partners, expressing all a strong commitment to protecting education financing and outlining measures to safeguard education from the disruption caused by the COVID-19. Of course, we meet today in a pivotal moment. The world is disrupted because of the COVID crisis. We see a rise in poverty, unemployment, and inequality across the world, leaving too many people, too many workers and communities fearful of diminishing prospects, not just for themselves, but more importantly for their children. In the face of such rising uncertainty, it is not enough to look at the short-term impact of the COVID, but it's equally important to examine the long-term impact on education and other trends of inequality and dislocation, and the resulting social disruptions. These cannot be ignored. So I believe that just as we commit to economic recovery, we should join our forces to ensure the dignity of every human being. The right to education is at the core of the SDG 4 and in the aspiration of leaving no one behind. Of course, leaving no one behind is not easy. It's hard, and it can be harder in time of crisis when the future seems uncertain. But we stand firmly for those rights. And on the 14th of December, UNESCO and the international community will celebrate the adoption of the Convention on the Right to Education. I hope you can join us and share the key messages about leaving no one behind. Before handing over the microphone to Ms. Stefania Giannini, Assistant Director General for Education at UNESCO, and Mr. Robert Jenkins, Chief of Education and Associate Director at Unicef for their opening remarks, let me briefly introduce the agenda. You can also find the documents and short biographies of speakers and the moderators in the link provided in the chat room. After the welcome remark by Stefania and Robert, my colleague Guanchol Chang, Chief of Education Policy, will give an overview, presenting a summary of the UNESCO's recent research work on fiscal responses to education and training in the context of the COVID. A link to the full report is provided in the chat box. We are grateful to the Global Education Coalition members for their support and contribution, including colleagues at KPMG, McKinsey, OECD, UNICEF, World Bank, and IMF for all the information and the resources that they kindly shared with us to help us to produce the report. The presentation from my colleague Wanchol will be followed by 2 panel discussions. One will focus on country experiences with the objective to share what are the lessons learned, what are the challenges, and what are the future direction in their fiscal policy responses to address the COVID-19 with a specific focus on education and training. The second session will focus more on the role of international organization and also, importantly, the public-private partnership. After the 2 panel discussions, we'll have time for discussion and, as I mentioned earlier, for Q&A. So please don't hesitate to send us your questions and comment in the Q&A space. My colleagues will collect your questions and ask them to the speakers as much as we can in the dedicated session. Dear colleagues, I have the pleasure and honor to invite now Madame Stefania Giannini for her opening remarks. Thank you, Stefania, for joining us today. We look forward to hear from you the lessons learned from the Global Education Meeting and the direction that UNESCO is giving to monitor education financing and sharing experience on the lessons learned in this context. Please, Stefania.
Thank you very much, Boren. Good afternoon, morning, evening to everybody, and a warm welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining today's webinar on a very timely topic, investing in education and training and protecting financing in education somehow. And this gets straight to the point of the discussion you'll have in this webinar today, as the IMF puts in their annual report, a year like no other. The global economy faces a deep and very significant recession this year. Let me recall some numbers that I'm sure this audience knows very well, but they are important to set a bit the scene. Global growth, or rather recession, is projected at minus 4.4%. That means close to 100 million people are expected to fall into extreme deprivation. And that means, as ILO, our colleagues in ILO estimates, that working hour losses are equivalent to the loss of almost 500 million full-time jobs globally. And the return to normal, of course, will likely be long and very uncertain. Global growth is projected now at 5.2% in 2021, and the level of global GDP is expected to be a very modest 1.6% above that of last year. Well, at national level, governments, parliaments are taking measure, of course, are discussing about and finalizing important decisions about this topic. It's a question of a variety, putting in practice a variety of fiscal measures that include efforts to cushion income losses, incentivize hiring, expand the social assistance and welfare. We see the discussion in Europe and very many other regions of the world. By mid-September 2020, this year, they had invested globally 12 trillion US dollars as stimulus packages as fiscal response to save lives and mitigate economic shocks. Such packages should absolutely mitigate the shock to education as well, recognizing education as a basic priority in these public policies remediation actions. But as we will discuss today, we have analyzed these fiscal stimulus packages a bit more in detail and found that globally resources allocated to education so far are less than 1% of the overall budgets. And this, of course, endangers the educational futures of millions of children and youth, and it endangers also the future prosperity. We know, and we say many times in our, we said in many times in our webinars during these last months, will not be able to build back better and to recover the policies we need. We know education as a top priority in the list. And let me recall how hard education has been. 17 weeks of learning lost in low-income countries against 11 in high-income ones. 1/3 of the world's students had no access to remote learning solutions during the period of school closures. Just published an interesting survey, a report from Unicef and ITU about this topic. I'm sure my colleague Rob Jenkins will touch upon this topic in his contribution. And we estimate as UNESCO that 24 million students from pre-primary to university level are today at risk of dropout this year because of the pandemic. Well, more than ever, education must be considered as a public good, as a top priority in political agendas in all regions of the world. Societies will not recover without investment in education, to help children who have fallen behind, to ensure that they can return safely to school, to improve quality, to combine, it's possible to do that, the right to education and the right to health, and also the right to have a more sustainable and prosperous society and cohesion in society in the coming months and years. In October this year, UNESCO, with all our partners, convened an extraordinary session of the Global Education Meeting, which is a part of the roadmap to implement and monitor the SDG 4 action plan. And in that virtual room, 14 heads of state and government, more than 80 ministers, all our UN agencies, heads and executive directors committed to an important agenda, which has as a first topic, protecting financing in education, not leaving education as a sector behind, and identifying some key priority areas to be developed in the coming months in order to make this sector a real driver for development, the development we need, especially within this COVID-19, and looking forward to the back to building better after the COVID-19. In the declaration, the participating countries expressed their commitment to assure that national recovery stimulus packages will include allocations to education and training. We cannot afford to let the impact of lost learning affect the future of our societies for decades to come. Education and health, as I said, are the most important determinants of the human capital index. And we need political will, and we need resources, and we need international solidarity to prioritize education more than ever on national and global agendas. And several countries joining the discussion today are championing this course, leveraging the power of education and training as key investment, not only for a robust economy recovery, which is important, of course, but to pave the way towards more inclusive, more resilient, more sustainable societies. It's our mission, our common mission. And this pandemic, to conclude, let me say, calls for something else. It calls for an urgent paradigm shift, which is about changing the mindset in terms of political decisions, in terms of individual behaviors, in terms of a new kind of solidarity and partnership that definitely we are really putting in practice in the UN system with our partners. And this about also, and this is very much about capitalizing on opportunity in the next years we have through the G7, through the G20, among other instances. The COVID-19 education crisis has clearly demonstrated that we can work together to find solutions as reflected, for example, in the Global Education Coalition to support learning continuity. I believe that this webinar today will provide critical information for turning this commitment to reality with all stakeholders on deck. And I thank you very much and wish for a fruitful discussion. Over to you, Beren.
Thank you so much, Stefania, for these very clear and the insight regarding both the situation internationally, the outcomes of the Global Education Meeting, but particularly the word of hope and action that you are calling for. These are very important for us today, and these are critical for actions in the next few weeks and few months. Let me now give the floor to my colleague, Robert Jenkins, Chief of Education and Associate Director of Unicef. Robert, I hope you have had your coffee and you are ready to start with us. Good morning to you. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Barhan. And it's great to see everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. And it's a great privilege of mine to join my dear friend and colleague Stefania on these at this very important workshop and providing some opening remarks. I will just be building on Stefania's comments. UNESCO and Unicef work so closely together in the response to this COVID, but also in many of the topics that Stefania has raised. So I'll just supplement, and we'll be very brief because, of course, it's a very interesting and very constructive and substantive agenda, which we look forward to discussing. Building on some of the statistics that Stefania had mentioned, we recognize that we were experiencing some fiscal challenges before COVID-19 in education, with governments on average devoting 15% of their overall expenditure, overall expenditure to education, 15% against an indicative benchmark, as we all know, of 20%. So indeed, there was fiscal constraints prior. And as Stefania mentioned, the impact of COVID-19 on economies in general, but also on the fiscal space of countries is indeed proving to be very challenging. Let me just take a minute, Borjan, and mention the COVID response. And governments worldwide have invested over $10 trillion, roughly $11.8 trillion in stimulus packages as a fiscal response to the economic shocks and to mitigate those economic shocks on people's lives. And despite the huge disruption within education has received a very small percentage of that fiscal stimulus and indeed is facing enormous fiscal pressure. And this is running into then a challenge of, and something we're engaging with UNESCO and Unicef and the World Bank and other key partners, engaging with governments to discuss how do we find a solution to not compromising the long-term sustainability of economies and enabling children to realize their full right to education by meeting the immediate fiscal constraints that many governments are under. So we're in this workshop, in this webinar, I think, will be a good step forward in discussing the possible and potential solutions to that challenge. We do recognize that if you look at the budget scenarios now, there could be an annual financing gap of $200 billion over the next 10 years. And this is against an ODA, the Official Development Overseas Assistance, Development and Humanitarian Assistance, that organizations like ourselves and UNESCO and others and bilateral governments are supporting education overseas, which is around $16 billion. So the gap will be 200. ODA in education represent about 16. So the solution, unfortunately, will not be from international or development assistance. The solution will be in domestic financing predominantly. So the need, again, to engage with the key decision makers, many of which are involved in today's discussion, to find a solution. Now, the fiscal constraints that governments are under are going to be against a backdrop of indeed very real needs in financing education at the moment. We recognize the importance as the disruption of education of, well, at the height of the pandemic, over 90% of enrolled children, the importance now as schools are reopening and children are re-entering, programs such as remediation and re-enrollment drives and second chance programs, and Stefania mentioned Building Back Better. So we have an urgent need to protect education expenditure, but frankly, to increase education expenditure in order to mitigate the impact of the disruption on children's lives. So there is a very challenging disconnect, if you'd like, and we look forward to finding the solutions together in this webinar, but also moving forward. I do want to just building on Stefania's ideas on moving forward, just to supplement by adding 4 brief ones. One, of course, an overall theme today will be the importance of protecting education financing, avoiding compromising long-term sustainability to meet short-term fiscal constraints. So that's one. 2, would encourage all of us to prioritize resources which reach vulnerable and marginalized children. And we know that was a challenge before COVID-19. Disparities have increased, so it's even a greater challenge now. So the second recommendation would be to look at things like incidence analysis and analyze budgets and of development organizations, humanitarian organizations, and governments, and ensure we prioritize reaching vulnerable groups. Third, focus on results-oriented and innovative approaches in financing. We do recognize that with the long-standing learning crisis, new and innovative approaches, including those that are technology-enabled, do have great potential and can maximize the use of every dollar. And the fourth, Stefania mentioned it, and I think it's an indication of how closely we work together, UNESCO and ourselves at Unicef, is partnerships. Indeed, such a challenge will require very close partnerships at the global level, like between our 2 organizations, but at all levels, at country level, national level, community, and partnering with parents and children themselves. With such a enormous challenge, indeed, partnerships will be absolutely critical. So thanks again for this opportunity. I very much look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Robert. And it's really very important, the points that you are highlighting and the trade-offs that probably policymakers will have to make, both in terms of what are the priorities in terms of short-term, but also how to invest for the future as well. And the 4 pointers that you referred to, I'm sure that in the discussion we'll have. I must add another aspect related to what Stefania and you, Robert, were saying, is that there is also risk that all this innovation, all these investment that happened during the COVID crisis, the investment, for example, on digital inclusion, may stop because we are reopening schools. And one important message that we should pass is that those investments should continue, so that we make that transformation and that changes that we hope will have and leapfrog from the situation that we had before the crisis, because we were in reality in crisis before the crisis. Thank you very much, Stefania and Robert. It's always good to have the tandem opening and putting a bit and setting the scene. Stay in tandem. We need you both working together, and we need both organizations putting hand in hand to advance. And there is a research agenda that we will come back to it probably at the end of this webinar. Now, let me give the floor to my colleague Guangchol Chol. Guangchol has been leading the team that worked on the policy paper that we have prepared. He has been working with several partners that I mentioned earlier, and he will make an introduction about the fiscal responses to education and training, the lessons that we have learned, and he will be also playing with the votes to check that the participants have learned the lessons, that you have read the report before coming, and that you have also listened very carefully to Stefania and Rob. So please, we are having a vote. So the question is, according to UNESCO estimates, what is the share of financing allocation to education and training worldwide in government massive fiscal measures taken during the COVID-19? It is, I don't know. It is more than 10%, it is 5%, it is 3%, or it is less than 1%. It's a quiz, and we will check who knows what and get the overall response. Please submit your response right now.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a good start, which will help me to not elaborate on the findings. So, I think we can end the polling. I do see a number of participants who are voting. So this is the results that I'd like to share with you. And most of the people say it's less than 1%, and I think you are all good learners. So today I will quickly go through some of the findings of UNESCO's recent work. On government fiscal measures in the education sector, and UNESCO, as many of you might know, published a working paper with preliminary findings, which you can see by clicking the link in the chat room. So very quickly, I know that time has gone over, and so what I'd like to say is that the working paper comprises 3 sections. In the first section, we summarize findings from countries around the world, 192 countries, mainly on the basis of IMF, Fiscal Monitor, as well as other government sources. To see fiscal measures and as well, especially how much of it has been spent to education and the training sector. In the second section, we took a closer look at the selected countries and examples of fiscal response spending on education. And the last section was about some conclusions and recommendations that we thought government would take, as well as international community, to consider in order to take a bolder and transformative approach. In the next slide, based on web data by mid-September this year, we can see that governments around the world have deployed some 12 trillion worth stimulus packages, of which 84% were from in high-income countries. Out of this 12 trillion US dollars as a global package, an estimated 91 billion have been dollars have been spent for education and training globally, which represent 0.78% of the total package. And in the next slide, I would like to go more quickly. We see the size of stimulus package and the share of education by UNESCO's regional groupings, where you can see that the region of Europe and North America allocated a large amount to education, followed by Asia and the Pacific, as you can see in this slide. In the next slide, you also observe that we also observe that governments have announced the packages in several phases in the areas in response to the evolving impacts of COVID-19, and according to the diverse needs of education, and following these steps that we can see: immediate support during widespread lockdown, or it is in the period of transition and preparing for gradual reopening, or to support for post-19 recovery. The next slide shows that a glimpse of government-related priorities in resource allocation in education as part of the fiscal response. So this is based on the analysis of 40 countries, and most countries, as you can see, seem to have targeted deployment of distance learning programs while developing new tools and solutions for remote and distance learning. Some 50% of countries, like 20 countries, provided direct or targeted transfer for families in cash or in kind to support to ensure social protection, feeding, and other measures. Other strategies that seem to have been popular include also financial aid to students, as well as health and sanitary support. There are also other measures that government took in response to in fiscal response to education. And the working paper that I am presenting has concluded with some arguments for protecting education, even including investment in education now and more in the era of post-COVID-19 to achieve SDG 4, Education 2030 agenda, and also as a strategy for an efficient, effective, and sustainable economic recovery. This includes smart and better investment in education while reducing resolutely education gaps through targeted public funding to education, especially for most disadvantaged and groups of population, thus contributing to reducing inequality and promoting inclusive economic growth. So this is what I'd like to share very quickly. And so I'd like now to hand over the microphone to Boren. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Guangchul. And as you have noted, we have rather very attentive participants, and the rate of response was quite high and also quite correct. So I hope that the presentation has shed more light, both on the quantitative aspect of the analysis, but also the qualitative aspect, looking at what are the measures, what are the strategies that should be adopted, and what are the trade-offs that probably governments will have to have. That leads us to the next session that will be moderated by my colleague, Kofi Segnagbeto, Head of Office at UNESCO International Institute for Education Planning in Dakar, the Pôle de Dakar, to moderate the next session, which will focus, as I mentioned in the beginning, on the national fiscal policy measures, what we have learned, what are the challenges, and what are the new directions, because we know that the situation is still evolving. We have good news regarding the vaccines, but we have also still bad news on the level of contamination in many countries, in particular in Europe, but also in other regions in the world. So without delay, let me give the floor to my colleague Kofi to moderate. Good afternoon, good morning to you, Kofi. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Boren. Thank you, colleagues. It's a pleasure for me to moderate this session. We have wonderful credentials today, and we all hear that during this pandemic, a lot of money have been put to the crisis to overcome the consequences, but less than 1% was dedicated to education. And that means that the solution to the education financing will be only domestic, not really on international aid. So for this, we'll hear what specific countries have put as a measure to mitigate this crisis. So we'll be hearing from, very fantastic colleagues from Republic of Korea, from South Africa, from Netherlands, and from Saudi Arabia. And from the very first speaker, we'll hear from Mrs. Anne Jenkins. Sorry if I misspelled your name. She is the Deputy Director, Minister of Education, Republic of Korea. And we'll hear about our colleague. And the question that we want this colleague to address very quickly is how much of the government fiscal measure, including stimulus package, is devoted plan for education and training, and what are Republic of Korea's future direction toward investing in education and training post-COVID-19 crisis. So please let's hear from Mrs. Anne from Republic of Korea. Thank you.
Good afternoon and good evening to all of you. Thank you for allowing me to take the floor. It's my honor to have this opportunity on behalf of the Korean Ministry of Education to share with you our Korea's experience of investing in education in response to COVID-19. First, let me walk you through how Korea invests in education in the midst of the ongoing pandemic. Our 2020 education budget accounts for about 17% of the annual national budget. As COVID-19 led to the expansion of budget spending, including for school disinfection and childcare services and the provision of both in-person and online learning, the Korean government pursued 4 rounds of supplementary budget proposals to set aside funds for impending uses. In March, the first supplementary budget proposal aimed to provide personal protective equipment and COVID-19 prevention school supplies like thermal imaging cameras, masks, and hand sanitizers to K-12 schools. For this, $250 million went to local governments. We also plan to provide $32 million for kindergarten operation during the shutdown period of educational institutions. Also for higher education institutions, we funded $2 million to support their online education by means of creating online learning infrastructure and content. In July, the third supplementary budget proposal was made. It is focusing on establishing digital infrastructure in education institutions to meet the needs of a changing educational environment and assign required staff and personal protective equipment. Specifically, $420 million were invested to establish digital education infrastructure in primary and secondary schools, such as wireless internet networks and computers, support online education in higher education institutions, creating online education support centers in campuses, and advancing ICT capacities of national universities. In addition, we set aside $65 million for job creation in the education sector to strengthen employment safety net and overcome the ongoing economic crisis. Also, to support youth, we decided to provide $5 million in scholarship to about 10,000 college students who plan to get a job or to start their own business. Lastly, the fourth supplementary budget proposal, which came out in September, to provide a special child care allowance and support school students to support their online learning. Korea is now poised to prepare for the post-COVID-19 era to facilitate innovation in school education. Above all, no matter what the circumstances are, we want to make sure that learning and growth continue and provide customized education for all students so that they can adapt to any socioeconomic changes such as digital innovation and to make our education system more innovative and inclusive, meeting the emerging needs of future society. First, we will ensure students' safety and reduce class sizes through the Green Smart School project and shift our school buildings into environmentally friendly ones. We will also prepare for a new educational environment, such as for online education that requires interactive communications between students and teachers. This aims to prepare for the post-COVID-19 era with our top 10 priorities for the future of education. These priorities include improving systems for both students and teachers, innovating teacher-related systems, creating future-oriented schools, and establishing an education safety net that supports students' growth. To prepare more effectively for potential future disruptions, we will commit to working towards stronger and more innovative approaches to build resilience into our education system and improve teaching and learning. For this purpose, we will support the development of educational content, technological and digital solutions, and other means of facilitating education continuity. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. You know, we hear that Korea has put a lot of measures in place, and it covers from preschool up to higher education. They provide a supplementary measure for digital education, online learning. They provide for school supplies, cameras, masks. That means really the shift to the online learning has really begun from Korea experience. So thank you very much, colleague, from sharing your experience with us. We'll move to our colleague from South Africa, Mr. Patrick Kunu. He is Chief of Financial Officer in National Department of Basic Education, Ministry of Basic Education in South Africa since 2018. And Mr. Patrick has experience in the Management Development Program since 2015 and the Senior Leadership Development Program since 2017. So, Mr. Patrick, can you please take the floor and share the experience of South Africa with us? Thank you very much.
Good afternoon and good evening to everybody. It's my honor to be part of this webinar. Our country, has, like all other countries, have gone through a very difficult period during COVID-19. What we did as a country was to first start by looking at what priorities have to be put in place. And what we did then was to make sure that certain sectors have to be prioritized for funding. For example, we prioritize 4 sectors: our health sector, our social development, police, as well as defense force. And we call these four sectors COVID-19 frontline sectors, as they were in the whole phase of making sure that the effects of COVID were alleviated. As a result of that, most of the funding were shifted from other sectors which were non-frontline to make sure that these 4 sectors had additional funding that was needed during at the beginning and during the height of COVID. What then had to happen is that with regards to the education budget, the effect was that we had to reprioritize the education budget to within our budget to provide for PPEs, that is masks, disinfections, and sanitizers, in view of the fact that there was no additional money coming from the fiscals, and some of the money had already been diverted to frontline sectors. The reason for these sectors excluding education was that at the beginning of COVID, a decision was taken to close the schools so that we could see how the pandemic was going. And then in view of the fact that the schools were closed and nobody knew at that stage whether the schools will reopen or at what stage they will reopen, that's why education was not put as one of the frontline departments. What then happened ultimately when the schools were reopened was that as one of the major prerequisites for opening schools, we took a decision to make sure that every learner out of the 25 million learners plus, every learner had to be provided with 2 cloth masks. Every school had to be sanitized. Every educator and non-educating staff had to be provided with cloth masks. So that's where the bulk of our education budget was shifted to. Going forward, what lessons have we learned, and what is the future investment in basic education? We are actually in the middle of investing in 4IR. E-learning is one of the things that we are accelerating, that is computer-based education and learning. We are also accelerating virtual classrooms, virtual meetings as well, whereas previously a meeting like this one would have involved traveling, accommodation costs. We are now sitting, without those costs, and as a result, we will be able, as a country, to offset those losses by shifting money from those costs that have now disappeared due to virtual meetings and virtual communication. In short, that is where we are as a country. Our education budget on average accounts for, it's about 290 to 300 billion rand per year for the whole country. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, colleague Patrick. It's very interesting, the experience from South Africa, the prioritization we have, the fact that you shift from other sector to education, and within the education sector itself, you reprioritize to afford for, mask sanitization, and, for the reopening of schools, you provide for everything the schools needs. And now you are shifting to e-learning classrooms, computer-based learning, virtual classrooms. So those are the things we can learn from South Africa. It's very, very interesting to hear from our colleague Patrick. So now we are moving to our colleague from Netherlands. From Netherlands, we have Mr. Yuri van Loon. He is a senior policy advisor on budgetary policy in the Ministry of Finance. He leads the work on monitoring the Dutch budgetary response to the COVID-19 crisis, and has prepared comparative analysis on the budgetary response for other Eurozone member states. Previously, Mr. Yuri van Loon, his roles have included consulting and research on the effectiveness of EU policies, the design and use of fiscal rules, and the European structural funds. So the very first question we have to ask our colleague is, can you please share with us what have been the challenge of your Minister of Finance in deciding on COVID-19 funding in your country? How much of the government fiscal measure, including stimulus package, have been devoted or dedicated for education and training, including skills development? So, dear colleague, the floor is yours. You have about 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and for inviting me on this this webinar. Excellent contributions so far, and I'll try to keep it short by also throwing some numbers at you. I'm, of course, from the Ministry of Finance, so we love numbers. Now, what we see here very clearly, and that's something that Rob Jenkins has mentioned as well, that we have, of course, very strong fiscal constraints in this crisis. This is a crisis that needed unprecedented short-term measures in order to counter any contact restricting measures that we took to control the pandemic. We've seen from the different countries now, of course, the different measures that we have to take in terms of masks, in terms of ventilation, etc. And we realized as the Ministry of Finance very quickly already that there is a trade-off between the short-term effects of the crisis and the long-term. And we all know that for the long-term, education is, of course, the central pillar in ensuring competitiveness, in ensuring that people can get jobs, in ensuring that people can develop themselves. So what we see is that overall of the total measures that we took to combat the crisis, we have spent about 49 billion euros. Of which, let's say, 36 was really discretionary measures. So this means these were measures that are done on top of our regular expenditure. Unprecedented amounts. We have never seen this before in any type of crisis. And if we look at the education aspect, we see this is part of a lot of the different measures that we have taken. So one important measure that we took is the introduction of a furlough scheme that's something that we didn't really have, strictly speaking, in under the Dutch Employment Agency. So we introduced this by providing, let's say, a compensation for companies who would apply for this at let's say the condition that they would on first instance not fire people, so they had to keep people on, and secondly they would provide them with additional funds on, for example, additional schooling and additional types of career guidance. So we spent about 200 million euros on providing extra money and extra resources for these companies to ensure that people that had to be laid off could switch to different sectors. Now, we also had, of course, and that's familiar for a lot of different countries as well, in March and April, we had to close down schools for several weeks. And we actually see the long-term effects of this closure already in the sense that, of course, students will have a delay in their study, especially students from primary education might have a bit of a delay in their development for math and for reading. And this will ultimately have an effect on the long-term development of our economy. So we spent about 500 million euros in ensuring that there's no backlog in the education by providing, for example, homeschooling, by making smaller classes, and making sure that the closure is as short as possible. So we try to make there also on all types of education levels, so be it from primary school to university, tailored programs in order to avoid any type of study delay. Provide compensation for students that are about to graduate, and also maintaining subsidy and subsidizing internship places in order for students to get practical experience before they enter the labor market in what will probably be difficult economic circumstances. We also spent a significant amount, 360 million euros on ventilation systems, also here to ensure that schools can remain open as much as possible. We spent about 200 million euros on improving protocols, safety protocols, ensuring compliance with the different measures, and therefore also ensuring continuity of the school year. Now, if we look really at our, let's say, the lowest level, we can of course include childcare compensation. That's something that Guang Chol mentioned as well. And there we made a compensation for parents, basically, because they couldn't bring their toddlers to childcare, and in principle they have a right for childcare compensation in the Netherlands. So all this together, including measures at the municipality level to ensure, for example, more tailored programs, we see that we've spent about 3% of our total discretionary measures on education expenditure. And that's not including yet the more social aspects from the Ministry of Social Affairs. So this is purely the education ministry. We've tried to link it as much as possible to social programs, knowing that especially groups that have lower levels of education are more vulnerable on the labor market. So fighting poverty and fighting youth unemployment, you do this most effectively by tackling education, supporting and guidance and providing guidance to new work. So we see also from the Ministry of Social Affairs that we have a package of about 1.4 billion in ensuring that these groups are helped as well. These were really the crisis measures, and we see that this is immediate and not necessarily long-term results, except for, of course, the condition of with the furlough scheme, where we provide an obligation for companies to provide schooling and ensure that that employees can go to different sectors. And this is indeed something that is kind of the prelude to what will come in the future, is that we will see that certain sectors might not stay competitive in the long term. In any case, all depending, of course, on how the vaccine and how the virus will develop in the first place. So there's so much uncertainty at the moment that it's difficult for us to say what will happen in the future. But there are elections in the Netherlands in March, and we see that all the major parties are actually they're promoting an increase of education expenditure despite the fiscal constraints. And even a high-level working group that advises the next government has indicated that there should be no budget cuts, at least on the education level. So the priority for education is paramount. We see trends of digitalization perhaps even increasing due to this crisis. And we also see that education spending will remain at the levels as they've been before. So this is a short introduction to the response of the Netherlands to this crisis and the education measures that we've taken. Looking forward to further discussing this later on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, colleague from Netherlands. It's a very, very interesting experience. We noticed that Netherlands only provide compensation for companies, but to mitigate the long-term impact of the learning, they provide 500 million on students, you know, to make sure there is no delay in their learning process. That's Thank you very much, colleague from Netherlands. From this panel, we'll be hearing from another colleague from Saudi Arabia. We'll be hearing from Dr. Bader Alyoubi. He is the Dean of College of Business at the University of Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. So please, colleague, can you take the floor and tell us about the experience of Saudi Arabia in mitigating this measure, how much of the government fiscal spend measure devoted for education and training in Saudi Arabia. So please take the floor.
Hi everyone. It has given me great pleasure to be with you today and participate in this webinar. Actually, in response to COVID-19 outbreak, the Saudi government has provided financial support.
May we see your camera? Can you put your camera on, please? Colleague, can you please put your camera
Excuse
on?
me?
Your camera on, please.
It is on. It is on, sorry.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
It is on now. It is in response to COVID-19 outbreak. It is on now.
It's on now. Sorry? Please go ahead.
Okay. Okay. And in response to COVID-19 outbreak, the Saudi government has provided financial support package amounting to 2,218 billion riyals, 58 billion dollars, with a commitment to pay 60% of the salary of Saudi employee in the private sector. Allocated to 2020, 193 billion riyals and 51.5 billion dollars, or 18.9% is the total budget in the education sector. Offered 100,000 SIM cards and 30,000 tablets to Saudi students, and provided a free internet data package for the approved educational platforms. This all efforts, and this is some of efforts in the pandemic and crisis. The face of the negative effects imposed by COVID-19 pandemic in the Saudi Arabia Ministry of Education, provider invest training courses to prepare students and academic staff to using a Blackboard platform. And after that will be in 10 hours, we are transfer all the students in the online classes in the March 2020. They continue to offer the financial fees and medical insurance and other benefits to Saudi students who are studying abroad, and provider financial support to Saudi researchers how focus special initiative to research project and related in the emerging COVID-19 pandemic. The budget will be especially in 7.5 million Saudi Riyal for the design the new platform about pandemic, and the 5.9 million Riyals about the develop the other PCR multigraded. And after that, they have our plans about this pandemic and this is crisis. We are the blended education model is high accepted by the Saudi University and going to be to applied in the university. And the University of Jeddah, for example, they has launched the fourth generation initiative. They called names 4G. This education would integrated the three education style. The regular style, it is regular education by 75% and blended by 15%, and distance education by 10%, in order to achieve the maximum possible flexibility in the educational process and the face of the possible change. The flexibility and agility will become to standard of our future program, and upskilling and reskilling in our main considerations. Fusion 2030 and new university B law approved by Royal Directors number M/27, the last year is going up. They confirms financial and administrative independent for all university and sets out their required governance and structure. The B law also enabled to the university to set the financial resource and including setting up education investment companies. All these efforts and some of this effort in Saudi Arabia to comfort the comfort of the corona pandemic, especially with the regard of the education. And we have contributed to educational losses also due the pandemic. And these efforts, I hope in the worldwide will be going up this pandemic, and all of them is healthy and good life, inshallah. And I thank you for your kind attention for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, colleague from Saudi Arabia. Yeah, for this panel, we have learned a lot of new experiences from countries like South Korea, South Africa, Netherlands, Saudi Arabia. We hear about flexibility, how flexible education systems have been, and how the government have committed to fund the sector with new fiscal measures. So this is very interesting, and this leads us to the education for the next century. Let's leave the floor to the organizer to continue for the second panel of discussion for this session. Thank you very much, Warren Shafin.
Thank you, Kofi, and thank you to all the panelists in the session. I think we have learned a lot about the country experiences from Korea to South Africa to Netherlands to Saudi Arabia, and they represent different contexts, different situations, but we see some trends in terms of...
Sorry, the interpreters aren't getting any sound.
In terms of the link with the education outcomes and investing in teachers, aspects related to...
The interpreters are getting no sound, I'm sorry.
We will have, in the Q&A session, we'll have opportunities to engage further. Without a delay, we need to move to the next session, and we hope to make a more, I would say, more accelerated pace in this case. And I would rely on my colleague, Margaret Arvin, education economist at the Global Partnership for Education, who will be moderating this session, to take us to what is the role of the international organization, how the public-private partnership can advance the agenda, and where the investment will come from.
Thank you, Boheen, and thank you to the previous panelists for those really useful insights into some very specific country level responses. As Boheen said, we kind of are wanting to shift gear a little now to focus more on the role of the international community. So as Rob mentioned in his opening comments, really partnerships are going to be one of the key dimensions of how we respond effectively to this pandemic. And so for this panel, we're really going to be looking at international organizations. We're going to be looking at private-public partnerships. And we're going to see how we can work together to try to meet the financial commitments of the GEM 2020 declaration. And so we have 4 panelists. We're going to start with a colleague from the IMF, but before I introduce our panelists, I'm just going to reinforce the request, if possible, if our panelists can try to stick to quite concise answers, 3 to 4 minutes, because we really do want to have some time at the end of the session to allow for responses to questions that have been raised by those in attendance. So let me start off by handing over to Mercedes Garcia Escribano. She is Deputy Division Chief in the Fiscal Affairs Department at the IMF. And last year, Mercedes wrote a really useful and impactful piece around what annual spending needed to be across countries in order to achieve full progress towards the SDGs. And I'm going to start off by asking Mercedes maybe if she could talk a little bit about that study, perhaps unpack for us some of the key findings on what trends need to be with respect specifically to education, with an emphasis on education, and also tell us a little about some of the emerging trends she's seeing in terms of COVID-19. Give us some insights into what funding priorities might be for education in this post-COVID-19 world. So with that, Mercedes, over to you.
So thank you very much, Margaret. I'm trying to connect the video. It's not connected. I think these are on the rights of the host, but happy to connect it as soon as the rights are back in order. So let me thank you, Margaret, and also to express my gratitude to UNESCO for the kind invitation to this webinar today, and also for organizing this important discussion about education in the era of the COVID-19 and beyond. Before COVID-19, we knew that most countries, especially emerging markets and low-income developing countries, need to ramp up education expenditures. As you mentioned, Margaret, in 2019, the IMF conducted a study that assessed the spending that is required to reach the Sustainable Development Goals in key areas related to human and to physical investment. This included education, among others. The other areas we focused, in addition to education, were health and selected areas of infrastructure. What were the findings? This study of 2019 showed that low-income developing countries need a substantial increase in expenditures. We estimated that in the year 2030, these countries, on average, the low-income developing countries, would need to increase spending by 15 percentage points of their GDP on average. Half of this amount corresponded to human capital. By human capital, we discuss or we focus on education and health. A more modest increase in spending was also needed in emerging markets. For them, the average was, for these emerging market countries, about 4 percentage points of GDP. Oh, right now the video is working, thank you. So, as we discussed earlier today in the previous interventions, the pandemic is making the task of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in education more challenging. The pandemic is erasing decades of progress. Though it's still early to know what is the exact impact on education, we are observing that some critical education advances are being unwinding. Billions and millions of children are being affected in emerging markets, advanced economies, low-income developing countries by the school closures. We also know that extreme poverty in the world is going to increase. The estimates are 90 million people are expected to fall into extreme poverty, and this would have an impact also on education. As mentioned earlier today, there is also inequality within the countries. In all the countries, in all levels of development, there is inequality within the countries in terms of which groups have more or less access to education facilities. And the pandemic is going to affect what we are observing, is affecting more those vulnerable groups, those that were in the first place more left behind in terms of their education outcomes. The serious consequences of COVID-19 in education have been acknowledged in the October 2020 Global Education Meeting. So not only the progress is being set back or reversed by the pandemic, but also the available financing to areas of human capital, such as education, is more limited because there are new spending demands to address the pandemic, and also there is a decline in revenues in many countries due to the drop in economic activity. So the key questions that you were asking, Margaret, is what are the priorities? What is the road ahead? How to raise the required financing? So let me first start emphasizing that the country focus should be on economic growth, guaranteeing a sustainable economic growth, strengthening macroeconomic management, and tackling spending inefficiencies. It's not only important to increase spending in education, but to spend well. Key decisions, for example, are number of teachers, which programs, schools. So to maximize the use of each dollar, as it was mentioned earlier today, being innovative, focusing on the marginalized groups in the countries. Now, in terms of the financing, what can be done? Also, as mentioned today, the focus should be on the country's effort. So raising domestic revenue mobilization should be a major part of raising this financing. Before the pandemic, on average, low-income developing countries raised less revenues than emerging markets, and emerging markets less revenues than advanced economies. So there is some room in all the countries to increase their domestic revenue mobilization. This would require strong administrative and policy reforms. Boosting tax revenues may be sufficient for some countries, for example, for some emerging market economies, but it wouldn't be enough for most of the low-income developing countries. This is where grants and concessional lending through official development assistance and international financial institutions is so crucial. Delivering on the existing official development assistance targets would make a substantial contribution to closing the financing gaps. Next, philanthropy and also the private sector could play a very important role in financing the development strategy. Therefore, the country's effort should also be focused on building an investment-friendly business environment. Let me wrap up by emphasizing the enormous challenge in reaching the Sustainable Development Goals in education, as it is also the case for others of the Sustainable Development Goals. Countries' effort should focus on raising revenues, spending well, but this is not enough, especially for most low-income developing countries. There is a need for a coordinated action by all the stakeholders, including private sector and donors, a coordinated and joint action with the countries themselves in the driver's seat. So thank you very much. Margaret, back to you.
Thank you, Mercedes. So I guess some of the key things we take away from that are not only the risk of losing some of the gains we've made in education, but also the importance of thinking carefully and responsibly about fiscal choices moving forward. So using money more efficiently and more wisely, and also thinking about increases in domestic resource mobilization through taxation policies and so on. So thank you very much for that contribution.
Thank you.
I want to shift over now to our colleague from the OECD, Glenda Quintini, who is a senior economist at OECD, where she leads a team looking at skills and employability. Glenda, the questions we have for you are really, so far, what have you seen in terms of OECD country responses to COVID-19? And what kind of impacts have you seen in terms of economy and labor market needs and the implications for education and skills development? So Glenda, if you'd like to turn on your camera, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Margaret, and thank you very much for inviting me here. I think, I'll try not to repeat things that I've been seeing before. In the previous panel, we have heard a lot about how countries, we had 4 represented there, made big efforts to turn skills provision online. So this was one of the key elements of enabling young people, but also adults to continue training that had already started. Perhaps something that is important to underline is that this implied support for providers, support for teachers, and support for the final users, both in terms of software and hardware as well. In terms of reskilling, particularly of adults, because that's a group that we look at most in my team, what was interesting, particularly in the lockdown and the phase we are now of social distancing, is that there was a massive decline in job openings. So in some countries, it was up to 60%. So I would say most of the countries we have data on was between 40 and 60% decline in openings, job vacancies. And what we found is that the few jobs for which there was an increase in openings fell into two categories. On the one side, you had very unskilled jobs, so those that were in essential sectors, for example, security guards, cashiers, deliverers. And then you had the health sector jobs. So the response was really initially to retrain those who were either already unemployed or who were on short-term work schemes for these kind of jobs. In the case of the health sector, there was no time to retrain. So a lot of the measures were about recalling people who had retired, asking for volunteers, fast licensing, for example, and recognition of skills that had been acquired, for example, by migrants in other countries. And for the low-skilled jobs, the retraining was really relatively short. So countries in collaboration, again, I stress this collaboration between private sectors, social partners, and governments, they created very quickly short modules of training that allowed people to retrain for the jobs that were available. A typical example, contact tracer, for example, for which people can be trained really quickly. Unfortunately, going ahead, we don't think this is going to, we hope this is not going to continue. There will be a much broader set of jobs and much bigger challenges. What we've seen and what the recent evidence suggests is that we were right in assuming that, in fact, the pandemic would accelerate the adoption of new technologies. This is based on evidence, for example, on the previous global financial crisis, which is coming out now because we needed a few years to see what the implications would be of the crisis on skills demand. And what we see now is that it did increase requirements. So brought requirements up, increased the demand for high-level skills, high-level cognitive and social skills. And this is happening also now. We have seen already companies adopting technologies faster, mostly to of course, enable teleworking, but also to address the constraints of having workers physically in place. The other trends, the impact of other trends on skill demands after the pandemic are a bit more mixed. For demographics, we've seen a massive decline in migration, reduction in brain drain because of limited mobility, possibly a decline in fertility because people postpone family formation due to uncertainty. So there could be a different pattern, for example, of migration coming out of this. There's likely to be some reshoring of tasks as well that had been offshored. So depending on what countries we're looking at, you could be reshoring low-skill tasks that you had offshored to reduce costs, or you could be reshoring high-skill tasks that you had offshored because of exploiting a competitive advantage in other countries. So again, a mixed pattern there. And also for the green transformation, which we all very much believe on, there are some countries that have really stressed the green measures in their recovery plans, but there are others that have scaled back because of financial constraints. So overall, although there's still some uncertainty, we do think there's going to be enough general requirements for higher level skills. This means that I think we need really to focus on the transitions. Those entering unemployment are very low skilled, low wage workers. They need to be, if we want to put them in sustainable jobs for the future, they need to, we need to set up a process for transition that takes into account their skills, so a skills assessment process, a process of recognizing their prior learning, identifying the skill gaps relative to the jobs we want to put them in, and then matching with available training. I think the focus should really be, again, something that's been said by the previous panelists, on the most disadvantaged, on the low skilled, on those that are in jobs at very high risk of automation, which the crisis would have strengthened, and those who are receiving very little training at work.
Thank you so much, Glenda. So there were a lot of, I know we have a short time, but there were a lot of really interesting points you raised there. I think the need for kind of flexibility and responsiveness in the short term was one thing you highlighted, but then also, of course, as we see these kind of economic shifts, greater automation, the need both to make sure that the labor market is responsive to those kinds of change and need for skills, but also to make sure that the most marginalized are not left behind. And so this kind of dual-pronged response. Thank you so much. I'm going to shift now to our third speaker, who joins us from Microsoft Corporation. Alexa Joyce is Future Ready Skills Director for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa at Microsoft Corporation. And Alexa, we really were hoping you could walk us through some of your thoughts on two issues. So first of all, broadly, from your perspective, what have you see as being the kind of key impacts of COVID-19 on labor market needs and skills development? But then also, what prospects do you see for future public-private partnerships to help mitigate some of the challenges that may arise in the short term as we kind of make those shifts that are required in the face of COVID-19? So Alexa, over to you.
Thank you, and great set of really interesting questions to dig into there. So in terms of thinking about the impact of COVID on the labour market needs and skills development, obviously I'm going to focus principally on tech skills, as this is the area where Microsoft is experiencing the most changes right now. So I think one of the things I wanted to point out is just actually really how profound and significant the economic crisis is, because we're seeing in some markets that even the technology sector has slowed down hiring, and technology is typically a very resilient sector. And so that's quite surprising given the level of digital transformation that we're seeing in society and businesses that's come about as a result of COVID. So there's been a lot of increased pressure on technically skilled people in existing organizations rather than necessarily recruiting in new people. But there's still a strong demand for very high skill levels in terms of technology. So AI, data science, data engineering, those very high level cognitive roles that require both that deep technical expertise as well as a high level of interpersonal skills and collaboration and research skills, which speak to some of the points we heard from the OECD just before. But what we're also seeing is obviously a big acceleration in the need for technical skills in traditionally non-technical jobs. If you think about your local stores and in your town, at least where I live here in Belgium, we're seeing that the local shop is having to establish a website to manage orders and deliveries and having to set up digital payment processes and so on, which is not something that they would have done before. So there's this growth in the need for technology to be embedded in broader jobs, which has really accelerated dramatically since the arrival of COVID. And at Microsoft, we obviously have a huge amount of data from employers more broadly at our fingertips from the LinkedIn economic graph, which enables us to look at where are the jobs in demand and to understand what are the skill sets that those jobs require. And the most recent research that we've done with the LinkedIn team has found that many of the jobs which are growing continue to be technically focused, but they're often jobs which intersect technology and an other area of expertise. So for instance, digital marketing or digital project management. And we've built rapid fire career pathways with learning materials attached to those jobs so that we can help support people who've struggled losing their jobs during the COVID period to access the training available for free through LinkedIn Learning to actually get themselves prepared for moving into some of those types of growing jobs. I think in terms of the role of public and private partnerships, throughout the pandemic, the close partnership between public and private sector has been absolutely crucial in ensuring any continuity of learning in the education sector. And if we want to continue to drive the acquisition of technology skills and 21st century skills, as well as higher level cognitive skills across the education system, we can really only do this through partnership. And particularly also to think in an agile way about how can we build partnerships for employability. So having the long-term goal in terms of helping education systems improve their quality over time, while also having shorter-term projects which really focus on the transitions and recognition of industry certification across different education systems, so that we can more easily transfer skills and knowledge acquired outside of traditional schooling into the education system as well. And the global coalition with UNESCO, I think, has been pivotal in creating this much closer collaboration between the education sector and the private sector. We want collectively, I think, on the private side to really see that this continues, and we want to provide genuine value rather than be transactional vendors. When we take this type of approach, we can bring much more than just a service. We can bring our expertise, our volunteering programs, our philanthropic investments, our skills programs, which is a much richer way to work together with the education sector. And one of the things which I think is really important as we move forward is to recognize that many recent approaches in terms of transformation of the education system have been done as an emergency response. And so now, as we're moving through to a later stage of the crisis, we need to make sure that we collectively apply a lens of inclusion and sustainability to building the new normal, that we get those who still don't have access, the ability to access it, and that we make decisions around technology provision in a thoughtful way, which is going to really deliver value, not just going for the cheapest and easiest, but most educationally relevant decisions. So I think right now we have this unprecedented opportunity to continue to work together to build that new normal and create really inclusive and rewarding learning opportunities across the world.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alexa, both for highlighting the needs in the short term as well as the needs in the long term. So the need to have kind of two paths, I think, as many other speakers have mentioned. I found particularly interesting that idea that you raised, that it's not just technology, it's technology intersecting with other areas of expertise, and the need to have kind of specialized training or quick and readily available training so that folks are able to move into those areas as technology advances. We're very short on time, so I want to hand over to our last speaker before my colleagues from UNESCO will wrap up. Our last speaker is Zora Yameche, who comes to us from Ericsson, where she leads their sustainability and corporate responsibility team, and she leads their program on their education initiative called Connect to Learn. So Zora, just in the last few minutes we have, I wondered if you were able to speak to us a little bit about some of the important possibilities we are able to pursue to ensure continuity of learning during COVID-19, and then perhaps speak a little to some of the concrete actions or examples of strong, good PPPs, public-private partnerships, that you have seen in your work. So over to you, Zora.
Many thanks, Margaret, for the introduction, and I'm also grateful to UNESCO for this invitation, and delighted to join this discussion today. I did put my camera up, but I'm not sure if I'm sharing or not. So the COVID-19 pandemic has, as we've all seen, exacerbated issues relating to the digital divide. For some schools, closing means shifting to online classrooms and adapting to new ways of working. But for those in the world without connectivity, internet connectivity, this means that education and work has simply stopped. We know that as a result of school closures, the lack of internet has prevented some of the world's most vulnerable children from accessing remote learning. To throw some statistics, according to the International Telecom Union, 360 million young people currently do not have access to internet. Many of these are young people in low and middle income countries. I'm just going to try again my camera to see if it pops up, No, apparently not.
Your camera is working perfectly, Zora. We can all see.
Thank you. So I don't see it on my end, but I'll say the investment in remote learning should both mitigate the immediate disruption caused by COVID-19, but also establish approaches to develop more open and flexible education systems for the future. While it is evident that digital platforms will increasingly be the basis of future work and opportunity, we see connectivity as a key element of common good. So leveraging digital infrastructure to spur growth and recovery, including in the education sphere, from our perspective, is a must. So at Ericsson, we've been for many years now strong advocate of the power of our partnerships to achieve quality and scale with a track record of our own. Based on this experience, I would reiterate the message shared earlier by many, the importance of cooperation and the urgency to join forces and work together to address the deepening digital divide. I would like to share with you some examples of our own. So Ericsson this year has decided to significantly grow its engagement for education and chose to put its weight behind two key UN-led global initiatives. So the first one is GIGA, launched by Unicef and the International Telecom Union about a year ago, with the ambition to connect every school to the internet and every young person to information, opportunity, and choice. So to reach this very ambitious goal of achieving global education connectivity by 2030, GIGA is calling for multi-stakeholders to contribute with funding and expertise. So we see an important call to action here for governments, investors, the private sector, and civil society. So Ericsson was earlier this year the first private sector partner to make a multi-million-dollar commitment to GIGA. But in addition to the funding, we are committing technical expertise to help build capacity within GIGA and the government partners on digital information and infrastructure competencies. Earlier this year, also, the second initiative that we joined in was a global education coalition set up by UNESCO as a response to COVID-19. And among the ambitions of the coalition is to foster the development of open platforms to support affordable access to distance learning and the development of high quality training programs related to digital skills. So as a technology company, a bit of the same message as our colleague from Microsoft was sharing, we feel that we have a role to play in developing digital tools and content to cater for, among other jobs, high-level cognitive roles, as was well articulated by Mrs. Joyce earlier. As such, we've co-developed, as an example, with UNESCO, a digital education program on teaching AI targeted to teachers and curriculum developers that we are looking to deploy with ministries of education. We are also working in collaboration with players across the telecom industry to develop and deploy online courses focused on advanced digital skills, everything from automation, data science, artificial intelligence, telecommunication, and so on, and making them available and easily accessible and affordable for the general student population. So to conclude, I would say that our ambition, and I dare say our responsibility as a leading technology company, is to help build an inclusive digital infrastructure, empowering teachers, students, and schools, and contributing to provide young people worldwide with digital skills. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zora. It was so useful to hear some really practical and concrete examples of how Ericsson's been working with PPPs. The GIGA example, I think, was a particularly powerful one. With that, I know we're running a little over time, but I'd like to hand back over to our UNESCO host, Bohin, who I believe might try and squeeze in one or two questions just from the audience who've sent through such a rich array of thoughts. So thank you very much to our panelists for that second panel. And Bohin, over to you.
Thank you, Margaret, Zora, Glenda, and Alexa. It was a really very interesting session we had. Of course, we would like still to take one or two questions. Otherwise, we will frustrate our colleagues and participants. And I've seen in the Q&A many questions that are put by the participants. So let me give the floor to my colleague Satoko to ask one or two questions. Satoko, we are late, and I would like to ask the permission of all our participants to stay with us 10 minutes more so that we can pick up the questions and have some response, but also conclude. Please, Satoko, without delay.
Thank you very much, Florian. Thank you very much for the interventions and the questions, very interesting. And unfortunately, we have only time for the one question for each session. So the session one, we'd like to ask one question to Ms. An from South Korea, Republic of Korea. There's a question about the equity, ensuring the equity. What kind of measures have the Republic of Korea has taken in terms of ensuring the equity in supporting the students, in providing financial support to the students or teachers? That was the first question. So I'll stop here.
Mrs. An, I hope Ms. An is still with us. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Please.
But could you repeat the question again?
Sure. It was what's the South Korea's approach in terms of ensuring equity in designing your learning continuity plan? Have you focused on specific target populations, or what have you done? Thank you.
Okay, so basically, Korea has a policy of ensuring the equity education for all students, including like marginalized students. So, but for the COVID pandemic, not only the marginalized student, but also all students are suffering from the COVID-19. So we provided all equipment and all measures to all students, not only for the marginalized student, but also for all students. So basically, we put a lot of money into this stuff and the personal protective equipment and financial aid to school from the kindergarten to higher education. So it includes all students, not only for the marginalized students. So basically, we have a policy for covering all age students.
Thank you, Satoko. The next question.
Yes, next question is for the session 2 panelists. It has been covered also from the intervention from the Erickson. But the next question was regarding how can we do in order to ensure connectivity among the most vulnerable and marginalized populations. I thought we could ask Bora to talk more about the GIGA, and then also maybe Margaret and even Boren from the international organization side, how we can work together to ensure connectivity or to expand the connectivity. Thank you.
Please, Zora.
Thank you, Burhan. So I would say, as we were explaining, GIGA is one initiative that has been established by the UN to build a strong coalition that will help not only identify the needs on the ground, the needs in connectivity geographically and from a population's perspective, but also create the funding mechanisms to actually be able to finance these gaps. So there is, so the way to participate, for instance, as governments is to reach out to the GIGA organizers to include the countries or to sign up to these initiatives. And for private sector entities or for investors is also to see how they can contribute to the financial setup and ultimately, connecting the schools, connecting the communities by working within those bits, I would say. And UNESCO is working on the empowerment piece of GIGA, so I think you would be able to say more about that, Borin.
Thank you. I would like to give the floor to Margaret if you want to say something on what the Global Partnership for Education is doing for the most disadvantaged group. Margaret, very, very shortly, but we would like to hear you as well.
Sure, absolutely. So GPE has opened up a wide group of COVID grants, emergency response grants, to all of our countries. And those have been taken up by almost all the countries to whom they were offered. And we've seen a strong focus on reaching the most marginalized through those grants. So I think the idea for us has really been to be flexible and responsive with our funding, and then make sure that within the grants that are given to countries, we have been able to ensure that the policies and the programs that are targeted are really make inclusion for reaching the most marginalized. So that would be, I guess, my 60-second version of what GPE is doing.
Bravo. It was to the point. Thank you very much. Satoko, if you don't mind, I think we can stop here with the Q&A. Would that be okay?
Sure.
Thank you. Thanks to all our colleagues, to the speakers, to the participants. Of course, it's hard to summarize everything that was said, and I hope that you have followed very closely the discussion. Maybe I would like to put a few ideas that I think we can take them as the outcome of our discussion today. First of all, obviously, we have a hard situation with a large fiscal constraints on many countries, and there are hard choices to be made. But in those hard choices, and we have seen from the discussion, from the presentation in the beginning by my colleague Guang Chol, from what my colleague Mercedes from IMF has mentioned, is how to invest in efficient way, but also investing for equity and inclusion and for leaving no one behind. So that combination of efficient investment, but also investing for inclusion and equity is very important from a macroeconomic perspective. Another macroeconomic perspective is how to create the conducive environment for the investment from the private sector, because that's part of the contribution and the national and domestic investment in the growth, in inclusive growth, sustainable development, and in education. The second aspect that came out, and again at the macro level, maybe what our representative from the Republic of Korea, making link between smart growth and green growth, and the inclusion and recovery and education investment. This is something that is neglected, but obviously one of the next threat, or the threat that we are living with, is the climate change threat. And investing in smart growth and green growth is an important aspect that we need to take into consideration. Bringing all this to the education system, what this mean? We have seen from the different country experience the importance of investing in digital infrastructure, from the connectivity to the tablets, to other resources that are needed, educational resources, in particular open education resources, investing in teachers, investing in the capacities of the system to be resilient and to respond to the challenge and to the next disruption that we may face, but also to reimagine for more inclusive and sustainable education system. We have heard this from the different countries and also from the colleagues who spoke as well. Maybe a few additional points that came very clearly is the lifelong learning perspective. We have heard about investing in K-12, but also we have heard from Glenda, for example, about investing in adult learning. We have heard from the Korean experience about investing in youth employability, and other colleagues who spoke about that. Also about early child education from the colleagues in Korea and the Netherlands. So this lifelong learning perspective is an important aspect. Another aspect that I think came out from the discussion is the governance. And the experience from the Netherlands, and the colleagues spoke about the local level and municipalities. So this combination of national intervention and responses, but also local interventions is a very important aspect, and governance is there. We finished our discussion about the partnership, and obviously the public-private partnership is important, both in terms of resources that can be mobilized, but also in terms of the innovation and in terms of the responses that can be designed and defined. We have heard at country level, but also we have heard at international level, from the connectivity through GIGA to the Global Education Coalition, two aspects that Alexa and Glenda mentioned regarding investing in adult learning, in youth employability, in future-ready young people. So this involvement of the private sector, this public-private partnership is about resources, but is also about efficiency of the investment and its outcome in terms of labor market outcome and in terms of equity and inclusion, particularly again for the most disadvantaged. And that's what an initiative like the Global Education Coalition is aiming at. I would like to thank all the participants, all the speakers, my colleagues who organized this meeting, please watch our website. This survey and the analysis we have conducted, we'll be building on it. We have seen the result from the presentation made. You can have a look at the report, but we are continuing updating our knowledge, looking at new fiscal measures that are adopted, and looking also at what will be the international intervention and support in this context. So I wish you all the best. Thank you very much for having been with us today, and we look forward to be in touch. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Glenda. Bye.
Merci beaucoup. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Bye.
Bye.